5 reasons your podcast trademark could be rejected. Well, hey there. If you know me, you know that I am a big proponent of registering your podcast title and YouTube channel names and even social media handles as trademarks. It's a hugely important component in the smart approach to protecting your investment in the content and brand that you've created. So imagine this: you've spent months brainstorming, come up with the perfect name, launched your dream show, it's gaining traction, things are looking great. And then you get a letter from the trademark office saying that your application has been rejected, or refused is the word they use. Ugh, a rejected trademark can really throw a wrench into your plans to build a solid brand. The good news is that trademark rejection is totally avoidable if you know what to look out for. So today we're diving into the top 5 reasons that podcast trademarks get refused and what you can do to sidestep those common traps. Stick around. Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Legit Podcast Pro. I'm your host, Gordon Firemark, the podcast lawyer, and today we're talking all about trademarks, specifically why your podcast or channel trademark might get rejected and how you can avoid that kind of headache. So here's the deal. A trademark gives you important legal protection over your brand. It's the badge of exclusivity that keeps others from using your podcast name or logo without your permission. But unfortunately, filing for a trademark registration isn't always as easy as just filling out a form. Now, fortunately, I've got a free podcaster's guide to trademark registration over at podcasttrademark.com. So here's the thing. Trademark law and registration is a bit tricky. It's not so much hard as it's just very technical. And if you don't exactly meet the requirements, you risk getting that dreaded notification from the trademark examiner, that refusal. Sometimes it's just called an office action. So let's go over the top 5 reasons why trademark registrations get refused, along with some examples and some tips to keep your application on track. First off, let's start with the most common reason. It's that your brand, whether it's a podcast name or a YouTube channel or a social handle, is just too similar to an already existing trademark. The legal term for this is a likelihood of confusion. Essentially, the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office won't approve your trademark if it's likely to confuse consumers into thinking that your brand is related to another one that's already registered, especially for the same kinds of goods and services. So, for example, think about shows with similar names. Like, let's say you wanted to launch a show called Pod Save the World. Sounds catchy, but the problem is there's already a podcast, a good one, called Pod Save America. Even though America and world are different words, the similarity in the phrasing could make the USPTO conclude that they need to reject because listeners might find that the two shows, or think that the two shows are connected. So to avoid this, you really need to do a thorough search on the USPTO's website before you settle on a name. You should also check podcast directories like Apple Podcasts or Spotify. I say do a Google search as well. Go in Amazon and see what's there under that title, also just to see how close you are to other things. Because if your name is close to another brand, you're going to need to either change it completely or tweak it in enough ways that, use unique words or phrasing to set it apart from the others. And even if you don't find anything conclusive in those other areas, it makes sense to use a professional trademark search service to dig deeper. It's worth a relatively small investment to avoid legal trouble later, and it'll certainly save you a lot of money on the cost of a registration that gets rejected. So be sure you do your due diligence and run a search. Now, the second reason is that your podcast name is too descriptive or generic. This happens when your title describes exactly what the podcast is about without any creative or distinctive branding. And the USPTO won't just grant a trademark for these kinds of names because they need to leave room for others to use similarly descriptive terminology to describe similar content. So, for example, imagine you wanted to name your podcast the True Crime Podcast. Well, that title's great in terms of telling listeners what your show is about, but it's not distinctive. Lots of podcasts cover true crime, and because the name is really merely descriptive, it won't be eligible for trademark protection. Now, there is a little wrinkle here, and that is that, and that's actually the case with my own podcast, Entertainment Law Update. Very descriptive title. But after you've been using a brand for a long time, more than 5 years at minimum, it is possible that your mark can acquire distinctiveness. That is, it develops a secondary meaning in the mind of the consumers. And so they do start to identify that descriptive phrase specifically with your show, with your thing. And that acquired distinctiveness is enough to get past trademark protection. But that's a whole other wrinkle that you have to think about. Here's another example. Let's say you want to call your podcast The Movie Review Show. Again, just too descriptive or generic. These are words that anyone in the industry might need to use in creating their movie review show. So the USPTO isn't going to let one person own that phrase as a trademark. So to avoid this, make sure you're using a distinctive, unique twist in your title. A show like Crime Junkie works because it takes the crime theme and makes it distinctive with the word junkie. Those two words don't normally come together in this kind of a context, and so it catches the imagination and it stands apart. Use these creative word combinations or branding that makes the name stand out from the crowd. The third reason why your podcast title might get rejected for trademark protection is that it's geographic or a common phrase. So using these things like a generic geographic term or just generic words is another reason that shows will have their trademarks denied. So let's say you want to start a show about life in New York City and you decide to call it New York Pod. Sounds like a good idea, except you can't trademark a broad geographic term like New York by itself. Trademarks are intended to protect distinctive brand names, not terms that merely describe a location. And the same goes for overly common phrases like the morning show, because phrases like that are just so general, they're really hard to protect and they don't set you apart. The point of a trademark is to be distinctive, to distinguish your goods or services from others in the marketplace. So the USPTO rejects these generic and descriptive and geographically descriptive marks. So to avoid this problem, get creative. And instead of New York Pod, maybe go with something like Big Bite of the Big Apple or something like that, or combine the geographic or common word with some unique visual. So you could design a custom logo and apply for that trademark on that instead. But then you still run the risk of when you're spoken of about the brand, so be thoughtful about this. Number 4 reason is that there's not proof of use in commerce. This is a reason that catches a lot of podcasters off guard. Failing to prove that it's in use in commerce is it's a requirement. When you apply for a trademark, the USPTO needs to see that you're already using your podcast name or logo in the real world in connection with the kinds of goods and services you're registering for. So what exactly counts as proof of use? Well, for podcasts, screenshots showing your podcast listed on platforms like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, those kinds of things. And merchandise with your podcast branding won't do the job to protect you for your trademark. But if you're also making and selling t-shirts or mugs with your logo on them, well, then you can use those photographs of those things as evidence or specimens of use. The key is that you have to show the podcast name is more than just an idea. It's actively being used to offer a product or a service out in the world. Here's a pro tip. Make sure your proof is up to date and accurate, because even a simple typo in your evidence can lead to delays or rejections and things like that. And unfortunately, I've seen a few folks create mock-ups to try to get past the specimen requirement. And let me just say, that is a very, very bad idea. That's an attempt to perpetrate a fraud on a U.S. government agency. And the consequences for that, well, they can be really, really severe. Let's just don't do this. Either file your trademark on the intent to use basis, which gives you some time to get in and prove the use later before it's finally registered. But you can get your application in and get your place in line, essentially. Or just wait until you've got the actual proof. If you're only a few weeks away from getting it up and running, wait till you've got that actual proof of use in commerce. Once you have a couple of episodes up there on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, that's going to be enough to establish that you're using it in commerce. Now, here's the 5th reason why your trademark might be rejected or refused. You're filing in the wrong class. So when you apply for a trademark, you have to select the specific category or class or classes that describe the types of service that you provide. For podcasts, what that means is Class 41, which covers entertainment educational services. But also for podcasts, A downloadable audio file falls in class 9 because that's a kind of good. So you have goods and services to deal with. So I'm always recommending registering in both of those two classes, 41 and 9. But I've seen podcasters accidentally file under the wrong class, like class 25, which is for clothing, like t-shirts. Even if you do plan to sell merchandise later on, your core service is the podcast itself. So that's what you need to register in the right class or classes for that. Now, when in doubt, you can avoid this by consulting with a trademark attorney like myself, who can make sure that you've selected the right classes and you're doing the right things. And if you plan to branch into other areas like merch, well, you may need to file multiple applications, each under a different class, because tote bags are different than t-shirts, are different from ball caps, are different from chewing gum. So lots of different classes out there. The international trademark registration systems have, I think it's 45 or 46 different classes available. So we have to know where we're after all, you're not registering for medical devices if you're doing a podcast. So we don't want to take the words completely out of the lexicon in those circumstances. So, all right, let's do a quick recap of the 5 reasons why your podcast trademark might be refused. 1 is that it's too similar to an existing trademark, likelihood of confusion. 2, that it's descriptive or generic and therefore can't be registered. 3 is that it's a geographic term or a common phrase. Those are not allowed to be registered. And 4 is that you fail to prove the use in commerce with the proper kinds of specimens. And 5 is filing in the wrong trademark class or classes, and that's what leads to the rejection. So taking the steps I've outlined here seriously can save you a lot of time and headaches. A little research, a little planning up front will go a long way toward getting your trademark approved. And if you're ready to protect your podcast brand, I've got just the thing for you. Head on over to podcasttrademark.com and grab your free guide to trademark registration. It is packed with everything you need to know to get started and avoid the common pitfalls we've talked about today. Or reach out to me privately. Go to firemark.com/trademarks and you can schedule an appointment and we can talk about my services in registering trademarks for folks like you. So if you found this episode helpful, be sure to subscribe and leave a review. And thank you for tuning in to this episode of Legit Podcast Pro. I'll catch up to you next time. Until then, I'm Gordon Firemark, the podcast lawyer, urging you to keep on podcasting and keep it legit. Have a great day.